Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this panel from the UK Union Programme at the Centre for Geopolitics. I'm Hugo Bromley, and I'm delighted to be chairing the event today. The UK Union Programme is a couple of years old now, and what we're trying to do is study the current questions facing the Union in a longer historical context, but also to focus on the most important issues that the Union might face or might not face over the next 10 or 15 years. I'm a historian by training, and I was reading last week about some strange people called the Commissioners for Wool, who were founded in 1699. And their task was to ride up and down somewhat desperately between Berwick and Carlisle and patrol the border between England and Scotland, preventing smuggling and maintaining what was a meaningful customs border until the early 18th century. They were abolished with the Act of Union and they haven't come back since. But with the question of Scottish independence now for a long time an established one, the question of what a union border between the rest of the UK and an independent Scotland might look like is one that's very much with us today. Given the central role of land borders in Brexit negotiations, it's vital to explore this question long before it might ever arise. And I'm delighted to be joined by four outstanding panelists to discuss it with us. Professor Nicola McEwen, the Director of the Centre for Public Policy at the University of Glasgow, Jill Rutter, a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government, Willie Rennie, the former leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats and a current MSP, and Alan Smith, the SNP Member of Parliament with responsibility for Europe and EU accession, who we're delighted to say is joining us at very short notice. So thank you so much. Okay, a couple of points about the logistics of this panel. I'm going to ask all the panelists to speak for about 5 minutes, outlining their own perspectives, and then we're going to have a short conversation between the five of us. We'll then open it up to questions from you all in the audience. Please put any questions in the Q&A function, and then I will read them out. When we get to the end of the conversation, I will close things and things will end pretty abruptly. All right, I'm going to turn to you, Nicola, first, and then we'll move from there.
Hi, thank you so much, Hugo, for the introduction and for the invitation to join the panel. I'm really pleased to do so. I'm going to talk a little bit drawing on from a report that I did with a colleague from Queen's University Belfast, Professor Katie Hayward. We did a report a couple of years ago, I think it is now, for the UK in a Changing Europe, where we explored this very issue. What would it mean for the border between Scotland and the rest of the UK in the event of independence? And we assumed a scenario there, which would be an independent Scotland within the European Union. But of course, you know, all of that, there may be other alternative options in there that we might discuss this evening as well. I suppose the first thing to note is that borders are normal, and there already is a border that is significant, an economic border of sorts. There is a tax border, so depending on which side of the border you live on, you will be part of a distinctive tax regime for income taxes and others. There is a services border. There is an entitlements border. So lots of things already matter in terms of the border between Scotland and England. Of course, that would matter more in the context of independence. And here we are essentially talking about a customs border and a deeper regulatory border than the one that exists just now. I think I will also want to note that the land border is only one of Scotland's borders. In the event of independence, it might be possible to open up the other sea borders, the borders that Scotland shares with the European Union and with other European countries that are in the single market, for example. But here we're focusing on the land border. In any scenario, it would be a firmer border. I don't particularly like the words hard and soft here, but it would be a more controlled border than the one that we have just now. The extent to which that is the case would depend on the broader geopolitical context. So particularly if an independent Scotland was looking to have a closer association with or membership of the European Union, then the border between England and Scotland would be shaped very heavily by whatever were the arrangements at the time between the UK, the rest of the UK, and the European Union, because that border, that land border, would become a border, an external border of the European Union, just as the border on the island of Ireland is an external border of the European Union. So it would have to be conforming to the rules of the single market, for the rules of the European Union in terms of mobility and trade, and that would be shaped by whatever were the arrangements at that time. In terms of what border management might look like, it's important to draw a distinction, I think, between the physical border and the practice of border management, which often takes place very far away from the border, takes place in offices, in the bureaucracy, in the sharing of information. And all of that is really, really important to effective border management. At the border itself, is probably, I mean, there are relatively few border crossings that are main trunk roads between Scotland and England, which on the one sense makes the management of that border a little bit easier to envisage in terms of physical infrastructure and what you might need to check, but also it does also increase the pressure points in terms of the volume of trade that we know crosses that border. Final point I would make for now is that here previously I've been talking more in terms of goods and trade. When it comes to people, I think we are talking about a different type of thing altogether. I do not envisage passport checks at the border between Scotland and England. I think it's a reasonable assumption that an independent Scotland would be brought into the agreement that underpins the common travel area, which gives UK and Irish citizens the right to live, work and access services and to travel across borders freely within and across the British Isles. But it has its limits, and it has its limits for third country nationals, for example, that don't have the same rights of mobility. But a lot of those checks that would still happen for them would probably not take place at the border itself, but away from the border in the offices. And, you know, to some extent, a lot of that takes place already, as we know. And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
I'll go to Alan next. Forgive me. You'd have thought I'd have learned this by now, but there we go.
Thanks very much, Hugo. I promise you, I find a new and exciting way to get Zoom technology wrong every time I use it. So it's good to see you all this evening, and thanks very much indeed for the invite. You've got a really pressing topic for us in Scotland. It's a discussion that is rattling around our politics in a lively way, as I'm sure Willie and I will enjoy ourselves this evening as well, as we always do. But a couple of overview points from me. I mean, essentially, what I want to get across always to a UK audience when I'm speaking, particularly to English colleagues in the Commons, the SNP's position hasn't changed. In 2014, when we had our independence referendum, our proposition was that Scotland's best future is to remain within the EU, the single market and the customs union, but as an independent state. Our proposition was also that it was in the UK's best future to stay within the single market, the EU, and indeed the customs union. So when we're accused of weaponising Brexit or somehow using the EU question to further independence, well, no, it's not. Our position hasn't changed. Circumstances have changed, which I would argue make independence all the more urgent, because I have to say, worried where the UK is heading, because the UK is still negotiating Brexit with itself the best part of 10 years after the 2016 vote, which brought home to an awful lot of people within the UK in Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales, even the London Assembly, that the balance of power of the internal constitutional dynamics of the UK had all been designed, was predicated upon single market, customs union and EU membership. Because so long as you're within those three things, borders count for that much less practical stuff on a day-to-day basis. So that has upended an awful lot of the UK's internal constitutional order. And it's staggering just how little discussion there was of it, particularly in a Northern Irish context, and the deep, deep sensitivities of border issues on the island of Ireland. In 2017, and by all means, go back and check. In Scotland's place in Europe, the Scottish Government proposed to the Theresa May government that in recognition of the fact that Scotland and Northern Ireland both voted to remain significantly, in our case, and in a deeply sensitive way in Northern Ireland, that what we should be looking for was almost like a precursor of the Windsor Agreement, but keeping Scotland and Northern Ireland within, to all intents and purposes, the single market. And then we'd be able to work out all this border stuff across Carlisle rather than across the island of Ireland, where the border is much longer, much more politically sensitive. And we could have done that as an interesting academic exercise without an awful lot of the politics. Obviously, that's lost to history. That wasn't what happened. And Great Britain finds itself out of the single market, the EU and the customs union, where Northern Ireland has a position that, frankly, Scotland would give her eye teeth for. So what does this question, the question, very intriguing question that you've got, what will an economic border at Carlisle mean for the British Isles? Well, I think, and let's assume that for sake of argument, Scotland does vote to become an independent state. And I don't think I'm giving away any secrets, given it was in the Sunday National just yesterday. The Scottish Government is going to be publishing a European paper on independence to this coming Friday. So we're doing our homework on this. We are not in the business of putting up barriers. We're in the business of taking them down, but we are in the business of getting an independent Scotland back into the European Union. That's back into the common agricultural policy for our farmers, back into the single market for our businesses, back into freedom of movement in and out, back into Horizon Europe as a full total member for our universities, back into the EU so that we've got the dignity and the democratic solidarity of working with a global A-team across the European continent, where the UK is still trying to find a place for itself in the world. And I'm not hostile to CTPTT and memorandums of understanding with various places, but we must get real. I think the UK needs to at least rejoin the single market to go away to undo the economic damage that Brexit has caused. So that would massively change what sort of border we have at Carlisle. The border at Carlisle is, of course, the physical border for the land trade. Every plane leaving Scotland and landing in a European and EU airport will, of course, have no borders. And we'll see, particularly for trade and services, which is massively Scotland's most important issues, we'll lose land borders, we'll lose borders with all the other EU countries. And we know exactly what the border is going to look like because the TCA has been signed. Now, the TCA is going to evolve. I think with a possible change of UK government, it will evolve really quite quickly. And it's one of the things that I'm working for down in London to make sure that the UK, and I can say this with hand on heart, I want to see the UK have as close and deep and functioning a relationship with the EU as possible, precisely because I want to see an independent Scotland in the EU having that deep and functioning relationship. So we've got lots to talk about, but that's certainly, I think, enough from me as a scene setter, but I look forward to the questions and the comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to you, Ben.
Thanks very much, and thanks to Nicola and for Alan for setting the scene. I think I agree with Alan that on many things, I think there is too much power in the centre of the United Kingdom. I think it's a centralised country. I think the economic power in the southeast and the political power in the southeast does need to change. Where I think disagree with Alan is that the independence is at the centre of that debate now. The Scottish Government have been very productive at producing papers, but it's not catching the imagination like it did in 2014. So I think this debate this evening is welcome because we can get into some of that detail about how these things would work, perhaps in a bit more peaceful time rather than the heat of a referendum, which, for a matter of doubt, I wish doesn't come, because I think there are many other things that we should be focusing on just now that are greater challenges. There's another thing I agree with Alan on, is that Brexit has changed things. There is no doubt that Brexit has changed the debate. I actually think it's reinforced the case against independence. If you just look at Northern Ireland in itself, the European Union created a cradle within which the differences between Ireland, Britain, and Northern Ireland could, not happily, but could coexist. Those tensions became less important when there was the cradle of the European Union. I think that's equally the case, if not more so, with Scotland. There was a choice last time round as to whether we wanted to be an independent country, not whether we could be, but whether we wanted to be. I think there are more challenges now about whether we could be, because the steep cliff that would come, the choice that we would have to make between being aligned with the European Union or being aligned with the UK, especially when those two, the European Union and the UK, are moving further and further apart, creates more and more of a tension. Nicola's right. I mean, these things are possible to manage. The real issue is about political alignment. And if you read the Scottish Government's paper that was published quite recently about immigration, they have set out a clear desire to have political disalignment. They want to be different, significantly different. I mean, for the one, I actually believe that in many of the things that were set out in that paper in terms of a more liberal immigration policy, but the more liberal it is, and the more conservative a UK immigration policy is, the greater that border and that tension becomes. So this is about political will, it's about political alignment. And the other part we've learned over the last few years since Brexit is that uncertainty in itself causes significant damage. Mark Carney was right. As soon as the Brexit referendum was announced, there was an economic hit, and that lasts still until this day. So even the process of a debate creates a disincentive, disinvestment, and economic harm. And that's why I think it's important that we understand the practicalities through Brexit of what that would mean for independence. So I think this debate is a welcome debate. I think we do need to get into some of the details, sometimes the lack of detail that we had in 2014, so we have a better understanding in the modern world, post-Brexit, what that would mean for the United Kingdom.
Thank you. And finally, Jill.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hugo and others. As listeners will note, I am the non-Scottish participant, so I'm not going to take any views on the merits or otherwise of independence. That's a matter for Scottish people, voters in Scotland, and that is resolutely not me sitting in central London. But I think Alan is undoubtedly right that things have changed. Alan and Willie are undoubtedly right, things have changed with Brexit. But they've changed in two directions, I think, is the real problem for the Scottish border. They've made the identity case, the case for Scotland rejoining the European nation of families, much stronger for those who feel that that is an important part of their Scottish identity. And they've made, particularly while the UK as a whole has opted for a hard Brexit, sorry, Nicola, they have made the practicalities much, much harder than they were back in 2014, because the UK, through the Trade and Cooperation Agreement that Boris Johnson and then David Frost negotiated, has a third country relationship with the EU, and that entails various consequences as night follows day for any sort of border that an EU country, and we assume from what Alan says, Scotland would be an EU country with a third country. Now, that could soften, but note that even Keir Starmer, as Labour leader, has said that the UK would not rejoin the single market and the customs union. And while there are some things that could undoubtedly make things both in Northern Ireland and in independent Scotland significantly easier, for example, the UK agreeing to align on sanitary and phytosanitary rules, and the EU being satisfied about the way the UK was implementing that, there will undoubtedly be quite significant differences. There are limits to what you can do, and there are limits to what the EU will concede you can do while you are outside the single market and the customs union. And why is that? Because the EU can't basically concede more favourable treatment to a country that has decided to opt out of the club than it offers to member states. So the idea that the UK could do away with lots and lots of checks by agreeing to voluntary alignment without supervision or not paying in and various things, that's politically incredibly difficult. One of the things that is quite frustrating about a lot of the Brexit debate is that we always assume that it's just a matter of the UK or parts of the UK deciding what they want, and then the EU will offer that deal back. So once we've settled on our ask, the EU will fall in line. And I think the Brexit negotiations showed that actually the EU has a very, very clear view of what are in its own short-term tactical interests, may not be in their long-run strategic interests, but are in their short-term tactical interests. So there is undoubtedly an issue of quite a lot of complexity there that would need to be addressed. And I just want to focus briefly on what might happen in the aftermath of a positive result in a referendum. We know that the EU has said that it's important to them that independence be gained through a legal referendum. That's important to member states who face their own secessionist pressures, like Spain. So we assume there's a legal referendum. We assume then that the first thing that Scotland has to do and that the UK government have to do are negotiate terms of separation. That's not something that can be done overnight. And independent Scotland can have done some work in the run-up to establish shadow institutions, to expand the size of its state, to expand its civil service and things like that. But there's still be really, really quite a lot of work to be done. And if you look at the numbers, there was an early estimate on the consequence of Brexit for the much, much, much bigger UK civil service, that Brexit would require an extra 30,000 civil service. That cost the consultancy firm that produced that estimate any contracts with the government for 6 months, because the Theresa May government was so furious that they put that figure into the public domain. But I think broadly that's probably about right. There's been a big expansion. If you look at the number of civil servants in the Scottish government at the moment, I think my colleagues told me it's around 27,000. So you're looking at a very, very substantial expansion in the Scottish state, because a lot of things that the UK didn't have to do for Brexit that Scotland would have to do to re-establish sort of borders with the UK, but which it has to do things on top, like establish separate regulatory oversight where there are currently UK institutions, establish a Bank of Scotland, etc., etc. There's a lot of separate functions. So that's really quite an enormous task. I think just one final comment from me is that any European state can apply to join the European Union. So when my colleagues at the Institute for Government produced a report a couple of years ago about the timings of all of this, their assumption, it'd be very interesting if others have a different view, but their assumption was that Scotland would first of all have to agree separation from the rest of the UK, and it would only be able to become a formal candidate country once it had actually become independent from the rest of the UK. It might then be that it could have done some informal ground clearing, done some of the preparations, done some of those things that go on with candidates, with countries that are on a route to accession. But actually your formal negotiations, which then likely, if you go the fastest, which they took to be Finland and Sweden, probably last a couple of years, that would come after quite a prolonged process of negotiation of exit from the UK. And then obviously you would have to be able to put in place whatever requirements follow through from that. So it's not something to be embarked on lightly. It's quite complicated. We've discovered that over Brexit, just how quite difficult it was to disentangle ourselves from quite a light touch, if you like, union that had only evolved over the last 50 years or so. Scotland would be disentangling itself from a union that has lasted much longer. Obviously, some elements have never been properly integrated or fully integrated, so that's there already, but it is quite a complex task that you would be embarking on. And actually, one of the things that I think is very important to note from the Brexit negotiations is this is for life, not just for Christmas. So actually, it's worth taking the time to do things well, not impose deadlines on yourselves that mean you end up with botched, unsatisfactory deals and perhaps even deals that you enter in at haste because they seem politically convenient at the time and then regret at slightly more leisure.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I found that fascinating. I want to start the little discussion session with something Jill said, and I want to come to you, Alan, because I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts. Is it your understanding that Scotland will negotiate if everything you wish comes through and you've recovered from the celebratory hangover and Scotland gets to negotiating? Will it negotiate exit from the UK and entrance into the European Union simultaneously? Or will there be a period of have to be a period of time when Scotland is not in either? And if so, how long will that time be?
Well, there's always phasing in and phasing out with this stuff. And the good news is we are not the first state to accede into the European Union. So there's always an extent to which things catch up after particular boundary points within that discussion. Croatia's schedules at the WTO are still not merged into the EU schedules at the WTO, for example. We don't have schedules at all because Scotland doesn't have an independent set of schedules. One thing I would really like us to do is to examine the extent to which how much of Scotland's physical trade goes through England rather than to England. To read some people, you'd think absolutely everything we export doesn't go further than the UK's borders, when actually, much like Ireland, using the land bridge into the continental market, a lot of our stuff is going through the UK rather than to it. So that needs to be worked out. We would want to do everything concurrently. And we are not the first state to accede into the European Union, but we are the first state to accede into the European Union, having been part of the territory for the best part of 50 years. So a lot of the accession negotiations, a lot of the acquis communautaire that we'd need to align ourselves to has already been done. So we've been doing our homework on that. And Jill's right, we would need to establish some regulatory things that don't exist presently, but we'd also be able to participate in the EU's regulatory things that we're presently not part of. So we're exiting one union, but joining another. So I think there's logically a phasing in and phasing out that happens concurrently with those things. Obviously, we'd be looking for an association agreement in the run-up to full membership, which would need to be ratified according to the constitutional traditions of all the other EU member states. You don't have a right to EU membership. And I liked Jill's phrase about once the UK decides what it wants, the EU will just fall into line. No, that's not what it's going to be at all. We want normal EU status, same as everybody else does. We want to be a full member. We want to ditch the UK's previously sniffy arm's length approach where they opt out to this and they opt out to that and the rebate of the other. We want to be a normal EU member state. And yes, there is a lot to that, but I think that's a huge advantage for us to win. But to answer your question, Hugo, no, it's not you do one thing, then another. It's we'd be looking to do everything concurrently.
So you would disagree with the Institute Government report there?
Yes, I did at the time. And I don't think that's practically how that would work. It's not how it's worked in any other case. Okay.
We'll circle back to this, but Nicola, I want to come to something come to you about something actually Alan said about the Northern Ireland Protocol, because there may be people on this call thinking surely that's a model outcome, right? Northern Ireland right now is simultaneously in some ways in the UK and EU markets. My understanding is that that's not an option that's open to Scotland, but it's probably worth exploring why not, and why that comparison, while it's interesting in the discussion of the hard border, is less applicable here.
So the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Windsor Framework were introduced in order to avoid a land border on the island of Ireland. So the concessions that have been made to Northern Ireland are based on two things. One, the common agreement among everybody concerned to avoid a land border in Ireland because of the difficult history there and the fear of opening up any wounds that aren't even properly healed. The second thing is that it's a concession made to Northern Ireland because it continues to be part of the United Kingdom. And so we're talking about a completely different scenario with Scotland. Alan referred to the Scottish Government document, Scotland's Place in Europe. And the first proposal of that document was that the whole of the UK find some sort of compromise position that would keep it aligned to EU law, that would stay within the single market. And that was an option, but it wasn't an option that was ever seriously considered by the UK government. Nor was the option of Scotland remaining partially involved in the EU single market, and I actually don't think it would have worked. It was never seriously considered, and it was never brought to the Brexit negotiating table, but I think it would have generated many of the same challenges that we're talking about in the context of independence. And so it's tricky for a variety of reasons to see that working for Scotland. That doesn't mean that there wouldn't be any flexibilities. The EU has proven itself to be flexible and pragmatic in negotiating its solutions, but we shouldn't necessarily expect the same concessions as for Northern Ireland.
Sure. One thing that made the process of Brexit significantly easier on the island of Ireland was the TCA, the Common Travel Area. And there is an assumption underpinning a lot of this that would continue through and the negotiations of exception. That does actually mean Scotland ruling out ever joining the Schengen area. And I would note that that's a commitment that I think has been already made by the SNP. Is that right? Alan, is that right?
Same as Ireland, there's no appetite in Brussels to bring states into the Schengen area where it wouldn't work.
So I wonder if I could come to you on the TCA. Do you see that being a viable option to allow communities to continue to interact in the event of Scottish independence? Because it would seem to facilitate some kind of exchange and common cultural understanding, at least.
I mean, the challenge of the Common Travel Area is that underpinning the Common Travel Area is an understanding between Ireland and the United Kingdom of a broadly similar immigration policy, which is also why Schengen is not a consideration. But the independence paper that was published just recently by the SNP that I've referred to already does strike a different tone altogether, as well as detailed policy, a much more liberal, open immigration policy. So there would have to be some kind of compromise on that if we wanted to maintain that common travel area, because there would be distinct tension between the different parts or the constituent parts of the members of that common travel area. So that's again down to political alignment. There would be a compromise if we wanted to stay close. If we were if we wanted to pursue a different route, that would have consequences.
I want to go to Jill in a second, but Alan, do you want to come back on that?
I do. I'm curious about the extent to which Ireland aligns its immigration policy with the UK. It's a common travel area we're talking about. It's not a common residence area. This is about the citizens of each other's country crossing the border across the island of Ireland, from Ireland into the UK and vice versa, and indeed into Scotland in an independent context. So this isn't about aligning immigration policies in any sense at all. Ireland has a completely different immigration policy to the UK. It's got EU freedom of movement. It's got an entirely different asylum regime. It's got an entirely different immigration policy, as will we. That's the point. Scotland needs more people. We need to reject the hostile environment that the UK is ruinously imposing on itself presently, and I think that'll change. But the common travel area exists across Ireland, which is a far more fractious border than we're ever going to have. We're part of it just now. We will maintain being part of that in an independent state because we've got historical connections of kith and kin that we don't want to lose and we won't lose. If the common travel area works between Ireland and the UK, it'll work between Scotland and the UK as well, but it doesn't mean any cooperation in terms of making sure that our immigration policies are similar. I'd just reject that outright.
Well, if you check the various iterations of the common travel area, Alan, you will find that there has been an understanding about visa-free access for certain countries, about the arrangements, the underlying immigration policy is broadly similar. Now, I understand there's no direct agreement on that, but there's an understanding between the two countries about how that operates, because otherwise a tension is created between them. That's why it's successful.
which is precisely what we'd emulate.
I'm gonna come back to that in a sec. But I want to bring Jill in, and I want to bring Jill in on the question of our UK, because you and I are the non-Scots on this panel. I just want to make clear, in case anyone was confused by Jill's comments, I'm not Scottish either. How do you think the UK would have to change our UK, if you like, would have to change its government structure in response to an independence vote? What would that look like? And from our experience of Brexit negotiations, and I don't know whether the comparison here is with the EU or the UK, what would the mood and attitude of government in the RUK be towards these negotiations, do you think?
I think it's very difficult to tell this far out. I think it would very much depend on the circumstances in which the referendum took place, how actively the UK government had, as it did in 2014, had been on the side of Scotland staying in the UK. It's not under a similar obligation to the obligation it's under in the Good Friday Agreement, if you like, to sort of, leave that entirely alone and sort of not sort of be too engaged in that discussion. It's a very interesting question about the extent to which the current UK government really appreciates its sort of commitments under the Good Friday Agreement on that. So I think it's really interesting to see, may also depend on how decisive the vote is. Is this a sort of something where it's 51-49 for Scotland, and therefore the UK government feels has to act on behalf of some of the people who were more sceptical and want to stay in the union? Or is it something where it's 80-20, where who knows? So it's difficult to do it. But logistically, what do you need to do? So based on the Brexit negotiations, you assume that both sides would establish negotiating teams, dedicated negotiating teams. They would choose somebody to lead the negotiations with that, and then you would establish a process for doing that. Now, we haven't got an equivalent of Article 50, the process that was established in European treaties for doing that. So there's no sort of process that of what happened. So that process would have to be invented and ideally agreed between the UK and the Scottish governments as to how you would go about that negotiation. And then what you would set down what all the sort of heads of agreement were. So all the sort of chapters you would need to be agreeing on all those issues, and you would set up working groups of civil servants on each side. Each side might want to engage much more widely domestically. Scotland may very well want to invite sort of, Scottish businesses, civil society, etc., into take views on where they want this to end up. And then we would have to see how those were conducted. But I think one of the things that we have learned from the Brexit negotiators is that there is quite a lot of power with the bigger element. And for this, I think the UK government would regard itself as the bigger element. It's less the demandeur. But I mean, it's a sort of process that's going to be deeply destabilizing both sides of the border. And you could argue that it would be in both sides' interests, if it's going to happen, for it to be resolved extremely quickly and efficiently, and hopefully with an absolute minimum of acrimony. But a UK government would need to be seen to be being fair to those people who are staying in the UK, as well as to people leaving the UK. So if you look at sort of, some of the financial stuff, you would need to make sure, which I think might be quite contentious, shares of debt and things like that, whatever. I don't think it would be particularly in the UK government's interest, once it had accepted that Scotland was going, just as I actually don't think it's in the EU's interest to immiserate the UK. I don't think it's in the UK's interest to have failing Scotland on its borders. I think it would be in the UK's interest to do its utmost to make sure that it could have a good, positive relationship. And I think there's, arguably one of the sort of UK cases for independence is that this might, lead to a better relationship between the rest of the UK and Scotland. So I think it's sort of quite interesting
Okay.
to how it go, but do not underestimate how big a task and preoccupation this is for both sides. And as we saw, Brexit, which in many ways was a much more minor undertaking for the UK government than this would be for the Scottish government, Brexit absorbed massive amounts of ministerial time, effort, and bandwidth. I think the plus for the Scots, at least, is that the Scottish government, we assume probably we would have had a referendum with a Scottish government that wanted to see independence. So we wouldn't have had a government that actually fought on one side and found it lost, which was definitely a complicating factor. And we wouldn't have had a situation where, which we had in Brexit, where the Leave side deliberately, in order to create a Leave coalition, deliberately was unclear about what Brexit meant. I think you would have a Scottish government that had much more clarity about what independence to mean.
Okay, let's go back a bit. By the way, people, if people want to start putting questions in the Q&A function, that would be fantastic. But I do want to go back a bit. That's very helpful from the sort of logistical side of things. I want to go back a bit to this conversation about the common travel area, and to you, Alan, because you said something quite interesting there, which is that it's a common travel area and it's not about migration. Does that mean that in your vision of this border, Scottish citizens would lose the right to live and work in England and vice versa?
No, that's about our passport holders having the rights that we already do have, and that's about the kith and kin. We've got millions of our nationals south of the border. We've got hundreds of thousands of UK nationals here who'd want to maintain that. Now, we've put out the paper about citizenship as well on the Scottish Government side. We're quite clearly going to maintain a dual nationality. So people who want a Scottish passport will be able to get one if they're legally resident in Scotland on the Independence Day. If they don't need to, and that'll be up to them. And that's where independence for me is about political accountability. It's not about identity in the way that some people believe it is. And having those rights is important, but those are rights for our citizens. What I think Willie was talking about was rights vis-a-vis third parties, and the idea that we need to coordinate our external discussion on that point. But the common travel area between Ireland, the UK, Scotland in an independent context, well, all of that maintains. That's an article of faith for us, absolutely.
I don't think that's quite what I was referring to. I know Nicola's got a hand raised, so I'll go to Nicola.
Yeah, so just to clarify a little bit. So in the common travel area as it stands, it's not a legal document. There would need to be a negotiated agreement, but I think it would be in the interests of the UK and Ireland and an independent Scotland to reach that agreement, because it would suit their citizens wherever they lived. And there's a lot of mobility of citizens across these islands. We know that. But I would say that there's a couple of things to bear in mind of the limits of the common travel area. So it does the freedom of movement, the right to live, to work, to travel, to trade freely, that does not extend to third country nationals. So if an independent Scotland were to rejoin the European Union, for example, and EU citizens were using their free movement rights to come and live in Scotland or work in Scotland or study in Scotland, they would not have the rights. Obviously, they would have rights in Ireland, but they would not have the rights of mobility that the common travel area would afford to Scottish citizens in the UK. It does not extend to services, to the rights to provide services, so there are limits there as well. And there are also challenges that might come with it. If I can just give you an illustrative example. So the common travel area gives the citizens of the UK and Ireland the rights to study in the same way as citizens from that country. So that would mean that citizens from across the rest of the UK would be able to come and study in Scotland on the same basis, paying the same fees as citizens living in Scotland would have under the arrangements of the Common Travel Area. Now, that would clearly present a significant policy challenge that might have to be faced anyway around university tuition. So yes, it's a very positive thing. Yes, it would be in the interest of all of the governments and citizens to agree, but it does have its limits.
I promise I'm going to drop this in a sec, but I don't think I'm making myself quite clear. The common travel area, as you describe it, involves Scottish citizens who have Scottish passports being able to live and work in England. The Scottish government, as an independent nation, would be able to determine who has and doesn't have a Scottish passport. That's the migration system. So if you had a situation in which the Scottish attitude to migration from anywhere, Argentina, was very different, am I understanding that would mean that the UK, our UK, if you like, had subcontracted its migration policy? I think that's the point that you were trying to make, Willie. Is that right? Yeah.
That's
okay.
Exactly.
So that's my question, Alan. Is do you think this is sustainable if Scotland's attitude to who gets a Scottish passport and who doesn't is radically different to England's attitude, or the RUK, I should say?
I think it's entirely sustainable. I don't rule it out as potentially an issue, but I think the crux of that would be the attitude of the UK government of the day, and that's probably going to be a different scenario to where we are just now, thinking how reasonable or otherwise the Scottish nationality policy is. I mean, in terms of who we're going to give passports to, we've already set that out. We'll take much the same view as Ireland does in terms of people who live in Scotland, people who are outside of Scotland but want to have a passport. We're conscious that it will be an attractive passport internationally because it'll be an EU passport, not because of any rights to get into dear old Blighty. It'll be rights to get into the European Union. So this isn't a new thing for any country to deal with. There's been questions about Malta's passport policy. There's been questions about what Cyprus does with its passport applications as well. But from our side, we're not doing it in order to cause problems with the UK. As Nicola absolutely says, we want to make the common travel area work and continue because it's massively in all of our interests to make sure that it does. So yes, we absolutely would want to make sure that it does work.
Okay, I want to move on to a question about different sectors, and then I want to get on to the Q&A. I'll give you a last word on this, Willie, but I would like to ask you about this point about the size of the European market and the potential of the European market, particularly in goods. I mean, and there's a clear distinction in terms of the relative importance. I mean, the UK market is more important for both, but there's a clear difference in terms between goods and services about the relative importance of different markets. And in goods in particular, the EU is a significant market. So how do you imagine that sectoral balance would change over time? Do you see the benefits, the massive benefits of EU access through this route? And yes, you can come in on the previous conversation as well.
I just to finish off on the common travel area, this is important because we're not talking about just some small visas to target groups of workers where we've got shortages. The SNP in their immigration paper set out quite substantial differences to deal with the demographic challenges that we've got in this country. And that's significant numbers of people. And the more the significant numbers of people that come, and I agree with Alan on the demographic challenges in Scotland, but the more people that come to deal with that, the greater the tension is for the common travel area, which will require an agreement between the different parts. We can't compel the rest of the United Kingdom to agree with our immigration policy. We can negotiate, we can argue with it, but we can't compel, and that's the point. So just to conclude, I suspect I'll provoke Alan into another contribution, but the issue about trade, there is no doubt that the potential of the European market is significant. I, as a pro-European, very strong pro-European, want the United Kingdom over time to have a closer relationship with the European Union, to break down the barriers. So we end up with something that looks and acts and smells like the European Union, but perhaps isn't the European Union, because I don't want to open up that whole divisive debate again. But we can break down the barriers to have closer trade. The difficulty for getting to that point for an independent Scotland is the barriers that are in the way. We haven't discussed the issue of currency, for instance. So the European Union, I understand, are quite clear that any new members of the European Union can't have a currency of another country. They have to have their own independent currency. Now, the Growth Commission and several government ministers have set out that that could take up to 10 years for us to have a separate currency. And if that was to happen, that would mean 10 years, not just outside the UK, but outside the European Union as well. So we wouldn't be able to take advantage, Hugo, of the significant market that exists clearly within the European Union if we were to go down that route. So the hurdles to get there are really significant, even though I accept the potential is huge, and I think Brexit has been incredibly damaging. But my route to getting closer to the European Union, I think, is better than Alan's.
I do want to go to questions, but I can't let Alan not come back after that closer. And it does relate to the question I had earlier on about simultaneous negotiation.
Yeah, you can tell Willie and I have been doing this dance for the best part of 20 years. We know each other's moves too well. Look, in terms of the currency question, right, Belgium and Luxembourg had a currency union pre-Euro for the best part of 50 years. Willie's right in terms of the formal position of the EU in terms of accession negotiations. That is something we'll need to be working out. Of course it is. But it's back to my point about phasing in and phasing out. So we're going to talk about things simultaneously because there's a lot of things that need to be looked at in the round, not one after the other. And certainly for my part, in terms of getting Scotland back into the single market, there's the economic aspects of it, of course. But it's about getting back into freedom of movement. It's about getting our universities back. I mean, I'm sitting in Stirling just now, where access to the EU networks in all its parts is existential for Stirling University. And every single university that we've got in Scotland, every college, getting back in will be so important. We're talking here about the physical border at Carlisle, but most people, when they're interacting with the EU, are doing it through communications like this, or getting on a plane in Edinburgh or Glasgow, Inverness, and getting off a plane somewhere else in the EU. So we'll be knocking down all those borders and getting back into the EU. And I've said, and I've yet to be challenged upon it, I think from round about Manchester northwards, it'll be considerably easier to get physical goods into the continental market going north via our ports, once we have the links functioning, of course, because the customs will be that much easier at Carlisle. And then it's straight into no border travel at all once we're leaving Rosyth. So I think all of this can be worked through. And absolutely, there's a huge prize to be won in terms of getting back into the European Union single market. But my best case scenario in all of this stuff is that the UK gets real, and this will take some actual political leadership and some bravery, and gets real and gets back into the single market.
Okay, Jill, I can see you shaking your head, but we do have to go to audience questions. And I want to, I'll try and circle back to some of these conversations about direction of trade as we go. But I do want to start with a question from Jim Dixon. Do please put your affiliations in the questions, by the way. Who asks, I was born in Glasgow, brought up there and educated there. I now live in London and wonders whether that means he should have a right to vote in the referendum and what rights he will have in Scotland after the referendum. And so I'll go to Alan and then Willie on that, and then we'll move to the next question.
Well, in terms of eligibility to vote, I got this tight in 2014 because my sister lives in California and my parents were living in Kuwait at the time. So none of them had a vote in the independence referendum because we used the EU voting franchise, because there isn't a legally defined definition of who is and is not Scottish at the moment. We're all UK citizens and that's all we know. So there isn't any defined Scottish citizenship in that sense. So it's about the voters' role in Scotland. So to answer Jim's point, no. And with some regret, I have to say, but no, if you're not resident in Scotland, if you don't have an address in Scotland, then you wouldn't be eligible to vote within that referendum. post, if it's a yes vote, obviously you've got a right to Scottish citizenship, and you then have the right to be a Scottish citizen, as you do worldwide, carrying a Scottish passport, which will be a European passport. But in terms of eligibility in the vote, no, it's about residence in Scotland will be the deciding factor on that.
I'm going to check myself, but I think I'm agreeing with Alan. I think it's important.
Easy now.
I just don't see how practically it's possible to have an electoral register on the terms that Jim is setting out. How far back do you go? I think the most important aspect of this is got to have consent. And to have consent, the electoral register has got to have integrity. And for it to have integrity, bluntly, you need to live here. And it needs to be accepted, credible through the Electoral Commission. We can't really concoct a new electoral register just for this form. I understand the frustration of it, because many people feel quite frustrated that they've lived there all their life and maybe only been away for a year and they miss out. Somebody who's lived elsewhere for the rest of their life and only in a year for Scotland can get a vote. I understand that tension, but I just don't think you could really have a referendum that's credible if we set it out in that way. So I agree with Alan. That'll be the last time.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question to Nicola, and then Jill, you can come in on both that and the question of flow of trade and direction as well. And it's from Rupert Strachwitz, who is from the German-British Society in Berlin. And he asks that given that Scotland has been a member of the EU and has adopted all of its rules and regulations in the past, wouldn't it be very easy indeed for an independent Scotland to switch back into that mode? And I'll start with you, Nicola, on that.
Okay, sorry, just before I answer that one, I was thinking of the Gary McAllister question. Do you remember that at the time of the devolution referendum as well? So every time there is a national vote, this issue comes up about legitimate participation. Although I do, for what it's worth, agree with both Willie and Alan on that. On the question that Rupert asked, I don't think it would be easy. That's the first thing to say. I think there would be tricky negotiations that would take some time. I do not think there is a queue that an independent Scotland would be required to join. You think, if you take the scenario of if Norway or Iceland decided tomorrow they wanted to join the European Union, there is absolutely no way they are waiting at the back of all of a queue of candidate countries. It wouldn't work like that. How easy or difficult it would be dependent on the extent to which Scotland, as part of the United Kingdom, had diverged from EU regulations at the time, because we're not talking about tomorrow, we're talking about some hypothetical time in the future. And the longer time passes, the more potential there is for that divergence to kick in. And the second thing it would depend on is the nature of the UK-EU relationship. If it is more aligned, if there is a revision to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, or if there is an SPS agreement, for example, lots of things that are problematic now would be a bit less problematic at the time. But I think we have learned a lot from the Brexit process about what would be what the challenges would be. I think the European Union would be very firm in its commitment to maintain the integrity of the EU single market, and that's where the border issues come in. And so, you know, it's very difficult to answer exactly because we don't know what the scenario would be at that time, but I don't think it would be easy.
Okay, Jill, two things for you actually. One of which follows on from that, and then I'll go back to Alan's point about trade flow. The first is that, as I understand it, Alan, correct me if I'm wrong, the government in Holyrood, as it stands, are committed to imitating as much EU regulation as it can. Is that right?
Yes.
So my question to you, Jill, is how far can you go without challenging the EU internal market, the UK, sorry, Internal Market Act, But then I know you do also want to speak on the question of trade flow from Northern England and where it would go.
I think so. Scotland has the ambition through its Continuity Act to keep pace with European regulations. There are various sources of divergence, is the critical thing. There is divergence when the UK government does something different. There's divergence when the Scottish government does something different. But there's also divergence when the EU does something different. And the EU has, over the past 3 years since we left, had a very big programme of legislative change. The UK government in some areas has decided to follow that. In some areas it's decided not to, or it hasn't had the capacity to do that. And actually in both Scotland and Wales, we've also seen those capacity constraints. So if you talk to people in Scotland, they will say, even with the desire to follow, there's just too big a volume of stuff coming through to keep aligned. So there'll be a catch-up piece of work. That's but Scotland will be in a massively more favourable position to align than a country that's never been a member state, that's whatever, because actually there is a huge big sort of block of retained EU law, and the default in the Retained EU Law Act was changed by the government. So rather than sunset everything, it's basically retained everything except a schedule, frankly, of by and large, not entirely, but by and large, redundant legislation. So I think, it's a challenge, but it's not nearly as big of a barrier as it will be. But as Nicola says, the longer you leave it, the bigger the gaps will be, and the more you'll have to change things to adapt. And the more the EU is changing. So that's the other thing. The EU, Scotland would be rejoining, not least because of the UK is no longer there, is quite a different EU. It might be actually an EU that Scotland finds preferable in some ways, because it's a more activist EU. It's an EU that's spending quite a lot more money, maybe about to do far more borrowing, and it's on account of things like that. So it's a very changing EU. In terms of sort of, we've focused a lot. I just want to focus one thing about the border. We focus quite a lot on the sort of customs post at Carlisle and things. And I think, those customs controls are should be every bit as difficult at the Carlisle border as they are in going into Hook of Holland or, Antwerp or Rotterdam or wherever you want to go. They should be basically identical, because they would be under the EU customs code and single market control. So it shouldn't be any easier to move a good from the north of England through Scotland into the EU than it would be to move it over the English Channel. So it'd just be a logistical choice of which way did you want to go, because it's an EU frontier, and EU frontiers will run to sort of EU standards with vets and all of those sorts of things. The bit that does strike me that we don't ignore, as I have friends who live in the Scottish borders. They live in just over the border in Berwickshire. They shop in Berwick upon Tweed. At the moment, Berwick upon Tweed is still in England. Now, obviously, it might choose to ask for this session and join. But I mean, at the moment, as things stand, every time they make their trip to Tesco's in Berwick, they would be crossing an international border under those things. And I think it's those sorts of, I know Nicola says it's nothing like the number of border crossings that the Irish had to contend with, but there are some of those sort of practicalities as well. I think, that border became much more visible during COVID, when there were different rules. The garden centre in Duns was not allowed to open, so everybody went and bought their plants for the spring planting in the garden centre in Berwick. I think that's the way around it was, but there was certainly a difference there. But I think there are some of those things where, the border will be quite disruptive to people who may not be big supporters of independence, because I think that sort of areas out there, and I think that's the sort of issue that will need to be addressed, whether, because I don't know whether there will be any sympathy in the EU for that sort of thing. Obviously, they do manage the border between France and Switzerland for some things and do have some checks on those. They have things at the Norway-Swedish border.
I can see the phrase technological solutions looming over the horizon.
I think
from
alternative arrangements, Hugo, but I do think there's some sort of quite interesting difficulties there that you would need to take into account, as well as the sort of big idea that the border is just about sort of industrial logistics. Obviously, that's the big volumes, but it's not the sort of hassle factors. We saw an awful lot of problems with Northern Ireland, which have been resolved through the Windsor Framework to some extent on pets, but you can now take your pet into Northern Ireland. You can't take your dog for a walk in Donegal, technically, though I'm not sure anyone's enforcing that, and things like parcels and stuff like that. So there's obviously a hugely integrated economy, north-south, but there's also lots of those sort of personal integrations as well that become hugely more problematic if you have anything like the sort of relationship that we currently have with the EU.
Okay, we're coming to the end of time. There's two questions I'd like to ask. One comes from Yusuf Kashid, who asks, how might Scotland's innovation system be bolstered or damaged post-independence? How will independence impact the country's tech scene? And he mentions the Scottish National Investment Bank. And then both of these questions are for anyone and everyone, by the way. And then the second question comes from Professor Brendan Sims, who is Professor of International Relations here and one of the directors of the Centre for Geopolitics, who begins where you are, Jill, with the controversy over the Northern Irish border and the imposition of physical infrastructure. And he asks about the protection and management of that infrastructure. So what would happen if, say, unionists in the border countries tore down customs posts or border infrastructure created physical violence or attack? So two questions for anyone to have a go at. Who's going to go first?
Can I just say, I think that the reason the Northern Ireland border was so sensitive just won't apply. I mean, you know, the good people of Berwickshire may be very frustrated at their ability to shop in the supermarket of their choice, but there is absolutely nothing like the political tension that was such a risk in Northern Ireland, where, you know, already it's quite, some of those borderlands are quite difficult to police, things like that. So I just think that's not a sort of comparator you need worry about. I don't think anyone is worried about, you know, hotshots being taken, bombs being planted in a border control post in Carlisle or just the other side of the border in Scotland. So I think that's not not a sort of good analogy there.
I want to
add something there, Hugo.
Yeah,
sorry, it's just to go back to what Jill was saying before, is that there are particular issues about the border communities themselves on both sides of the border that I think negotiators ought to be mindful of. And the other thing that we have learned from Northern Ireland is how the little things, the personal, becomes political quite quickly, and the things that people have cared about, medicines was one, parcels, gifts, pets, sausages, you know, these are the things that have resonance for the day-to-day lives of people, that sometimes seem like relatively small things in the grand scheme of negotiations, but they will really matter to how all of this is received. So I think there is a lot. I mean, God knows if we'll ever get to this point, but there's a lot that we can learn, I think, from observing the negotiations in Northern Ireland through that lens.
I'll come to you next, Alan, on this question of customs impositions, and indeed this question of hostile reactions to them.
Sure, I should probably firstly reassure Jill and everybody else, we've got no territorial ambitions in the north of England. Berwick's status isn't a matter for us, it's for the good people of Berwick to work out. And look, border communities everywhere are special. And when you put a political border in a place, and there's already a significant border there in terms of what council tax you pay, the COVID rules, as Nicola rightly says, there's already a significant border there, and there's already a lot of interplay across that border on a day-to-day basis. Of course there is, and we respect that and we cherish that and we want that to continue. So this will be an external border of the European Union. It's not the first external border of the European Union, and we're doing our homework. We know how this is going to work. We're going to make sure that people, particularly in the border communities, have no impositions. And I would suggest, certainly on the Scottish side, that getting back into the EU will give us a huge amount of other advantages that will massively outweigh any potential downsides. And I have to agree very strongly with Jill. I mean, the idea that infrastructure is going to be somehow vulnerable to attack, I think we're light years away from that. And that's about losers' consent. That's about having a system that's actually credible, that works. And that's what we're working on. That's what we're spending a lot of time doing. But I'd pick up on Yusuf's point about tech and what independence would mean for the tech sector. Well, I have to say, getting back into freedom of movement across the European Union, in and out, I think would be one of the single biggest boosts for our tech sector, because they're struggling to find the skilled labour that they need. And if we get back into EU freedom of movement, that opens up a huge pool of labour to that. We'd also get back into the EU structural funds. Jill's quite right. The EU is evolving at light speed. The EU is putting serious money into the just transition, into climate change mitigation. That's all budgets that we're not part of presently, but we would be part of within the EU. I think Scotland will be much more aligned with the mainstream of European direction of travel on this. Now, that's evolving fast. We've got the European election next year as well. But I think we've got huge advantages for the tech sector and every other sector by getting back into the EU. But also, I think, and back to my initial remarks, that this will help the UK get real and get back into the single market, and hopefully in due course the EU as well.
Okay, there's a last question from Jeff Green that I want to put to all panelists. But first of all, Willie, I'll come to you both on the tech sector point, but also on the broader point about the unionist community in Scotland and how they would react and engage with a border. I mean, I don't think anyone's expecting any referendum to ever be 100-0, right? So what would a unionist community feel like north of that border, how they engage with that border, as well as the point on the tech sector?
I think there are dangers with constantly comparing ourselves with Northern Ireland. We are very different.
Yeah.
The emotions are different. The debate is quite different. There's less probably of a cultural divide than there is in Northern Ireland. So I think we need to be careful about drawing lots of comparisons between the two. The debate in 2014, some people enjoyed it, some people didn't, but it was nothing like some of the debates that we've seen elsewhere. So I think we need to be careful of drawing the comparisons. I think a lot of this is down to, in terms of the innovation question, is the underlying economic conditions, but also the issue of uncertainty. Because we have seen, Mark Carney was very clear about the damage that uncertainty caused as soon as the referendum on Brexit was caused. And that would be exactly the same. I pointed to disinvestment last time round, with the 2014 referendum. That would continue when the debate started again. For me, I think what we've seen in this discussion is that our interests, our common interests across the United Kingdom are clear. And we need to decide whether we want to reach agreement on those common interests together as a United Kingdom or separately. But whatever it is, you need to have an agreement. And to have an agreement, there needs to be compromise. And whenever there's compromise, you don't get everything that you want. And that will happen whether we're inside or outside the United Kingdom. So my point is, why go through all that uncertainty and all this debate that we've had this evening, which I have to say is not being replicated across Scotland anymore? And why would you go through all of that with all the risks involved that we've clearly seen through Brexit, just to have a compromise that you would have had anyway within the United Kingdom? Now, I don't think that's worth it. I think it's better to try and reform from inside rather than have a revolution to break apart. So that's why I think that's the difference, the genuine difference between me and Alan. We probably agree on some of the analysis about the faults of the United Kingdom. The route to getting a better country, we have different views.
Okay. I want to end with this question from Jeff Green, who thinks it unlikely that, or highly unlikely, that succession negotiations between the rest of the UK and the independent Scotland could be negotiated with minimum acrimony. And he writes, for a humiliated and angry UK government, there would be absolutely no electoral advantage in conceding anything to demand donation. In such circumstances, what strategy would the SNP adopt to get the concessions and cooperation it will need? And I do think that speaks to something interesting that's come out several times in tonight's conversation, which is the concept of engagement and engagement between all these different parties in these islands, be that the European Union, be that the United Kingdom, be that the Republic of Ireland, be that Scotland as an independent nation, or whatever. So, Nicola, I know you want to come in on that, so I'll start with you. But my question for all of you really relates to that. In what spirit would these negotiations be undertaken, and how would that spirit shape or not shape the border between a land border between England and Scotland?
In terms of the spirit, I think it would depend on the nature of the relationship up to that point. And the relationship between the governments is something I've spent quite a few years working on, and it is not great already within the context that we are in right now. And I think that there are lots of reasons for that, Brexit being one of them. But I think it would be important for those who are advocating independence to be mindful of the need to have a positive and cooperative relationship with the UK government if they wanted to have positive and cooperative negotiations in the context of independence. And there would inevitably be the need for ongoing coordination with whatever independence settlement was reached. In some ways, including around the border, there would have to be more cooperation than there is right now. So in transport, for example, there's not that much coordination between the transport agencies north and south of the border, and that would be replicated in a whole host of areas. You would need a lot more cooperation than you have now. I suppose to Jeff's point, I'll say one little thing where I do think there is a risk, and we saw some of the events at the weekend where there are people who may mobilise and who may agitate, and I think there would be common interest from governments to manage and minimise those sorts of interventions. Would England be utterly humiliated in that process? I'm not so sure. I think if there was a consensual arrangement that led to the referendum, and I don't envisage it being anything other than a lawful process, if you got to that point, as long as the details were written down and agreed in the way that they were in 2014, the details themselves might not be the same, but if there is an agreed and a legal process, then I don't necessarily see it as the humiliation that is envisaged by the question. And if you think about the many places around the world that deal with these issues in very different ways, in much more difficult and violent ways, then I think if we got to that point, and I'm not advocating it one way or another, if we got to that point, there is opportunity in demonstrating a way to manage this peacefully.
Okay, I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of our time, so I'm going to go round the screen in my own mind. So I'll go to Willie and then Jill, and then I'll conclude. Alan, as the person who stepped into short notice, you get the last word.
I think there would be no desire from a remainder of the UK to punish Scotland, but equally, I don't think Scotland could expect it to be compelled to agree to whatever Scotland wanted. And that's where the challenge is. If there was a desire to do significant different things on immigration or currency or the economy, then and that would that would require the United Kingdom to come to some kind of agreement, that I think would be challenging, especially if the relationship continues as it is. It isn't constructive at all. We can't get the UK and Scottish governments to agree on very much these days. I've never seen the relationship so poor. And I have to say both sides are to blame. I think there's a real problem ever since the SNP have been in power, and actually I think the relationship even back then with Gordon Brown was very poor at the very start, and it's got an awful lot worse since. If you're going to have a successful negotiation, if that was to ever to happen, the conditions need to be much better, and we also need to have a more mature relationship between the two governments. I don't see that happening, to be frank, when the basis of independence being pushed forward by the SNP and others is about difference politically. And if you emphasise the difference politically, the more and more those tensions become real.
I'm just going to say one thing on the experience of Brexit, which is I'm just not convinced that having the two sides negotiating, in a room together proved to be a really sort of super productive way of doing it. It becomes too, if you like, zero sum. And I thought this on Northern Ireland as well, though they did manage to negotiate the Windsor Framework in the end, that actually you might want to think about bringing in a sort of third party to set up the negotiations. So actually the aim was to have a sort of fair settlement for both sides, and you would do it in a more transparent way with some things. That was a really important part of the process that led to the Good Friday Agreement. So both sides feel they've got a fair hearing, do things, rather than it just be sort of both sides going hammer and tongs there. Because actually, as I think we've learning with the EU, the really good thing is to do separation. If you're doing separation in a way that means you can continue to work very constructively together in the long term, because you need to. And I think the other part of it, and I think this would be quite good to be investing in anyway now, is for the UK government to be paying much more attention to all the sort of, machinery we have now around making the relationships with the devolved governments work better, the whole IGR stuff and things, some of the things that were in the Good Friday Agreement, some of those north, south, east, west institutions, sort of things, I think actually to invest much more than they have done over the past 20, 30 years in the institutions, either keeping the UK together or making sure that the British Isles as a geographic concept can function well if people decide to go their separate ways after legal referenda.
Watch this space in the UK Union programme on that last point, by the way. But Alan, the last word to you.
Always do watch that space. Look, the question was, will there be a hostile UK government that's looking to make things difficult? I'd reject that premise. I think common sense says that we need to make this work. We're not going to change geography. We're not going to change the social union that we have. I'm an English qualified lawyer. I cut my teeth in the City of London working there. We're always going to have those connections, and we're going to need to make this work. And that means that the Scottish Government will need to engage with the losing side in an independent scenario. We need to make sure that we're one Scotland, we're Team Scotland. We'll all be looking to make this work. And we need to make sure that the UK engages properly as well. Now, we're not in charge of that, of course we're not, but all the conversations I'm having down the road, there's a lack of interest, frankly, half the time, rather than anything else. There's various people who wouldn't like to see it happen, but if it does happen, let's make it work. And in the wider UK public, particularly after the 2016 vote, and I know this from all my conversations in Brussels, there's lots of people who didn't quite get the yes movement in 2014, get us now. And we've got a different sense of ourselves, we've got a different sense of our ambitions in the world, and it's up to the people of Scotland to decide what constitutional arrangements will best deliver those aspirations. Now, I'm clear that it's independence back in the EU. Willie's got a different vision, and we'll need to test those out. But in terms of making the relationship work, well, that's about how we'll enter into those discussions and enter into those negotiations. But the lesson for Brexit for me is you need to know what it is you want, and you need to have done your homework. And we've done both.
Okay. I've learned a huge amount from today, and I'd like to thank all of our panelists for taking the time quite late on a Monday evening on what we will say was a busy day in the world of UK news to come and join us here today. I'd like to thank everyone for attending and their questions. This has been recorded. If you missed a bit, I know some people have come in and out. It will be put up online. I'd like to thank some people, particularly Jack Little, who's done a huge amount of work helping put this together. Who's a PhD student here. All right, please, as I say, not just on questions of government cooperation, watch the space of the UK Union programme. We'll be doing more on many of these issues. The border is just one aspect of this, and we do intend to keep convening these conversations. Thank you all very much.